Hey everybody, this is Ben Bowman and Alex Titus. Welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge.
I think it feels a little bit like a free-for-all. Everyone believes they're the best candidate in this primary right now. Vote by mail system does have that kind of an impact, right? You don't see candidates take their name off the ballot because there's still a lot of time between when you have to finalize and print. The circumstances that Nick Kristof is trying to get into this primary with his wild card is fascinating. What I don't know is if Dallas Hurt is actually a Republican candidate for governor or not. No matter who the nominee is, it'll be the most conservative Republican campaign in history because of Betsey Johnson being there.
All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Oregon Bridge podcast. We are excited today because we have a friend of the pod returning for, I believe this is his second episode, the third Knopp, but the second Reagan Knopp. Reagan, welcome back to the Oregon Bridge. How are you?
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you having me back. So I'm really sorry you guys couldn't get any good guests this week. So I'm happy to fill in.
This was a Tuesday night scramble before the Wednesday release deadline.
Let the record show it is actually a Sunday afternoon and it's nice outside and we're doing a podcast. So let's make this quick, gentlemen. But truly, so the reason why we wanted to have Reagan on was a couple reasons. But the first one is we want to talk about the governor's race. And for most of the campaign, it feels like the action has been on the Democratic side, like the Nick Kristof entrance, a lot of big money being raised, and then Betsey Johnson to some degree. But the last few weeks, the R side has been it's becoming increasingly exciting, and I would say unpredictable. There are some big headlines this week that we'll dive into. But before we get to some specific questions, Reagan, can you kind of outline the landscape of the GOP primary for governor?
Yeah, let me just pull up my list of candidates so I don't forget anyone. So I think at the top, you got to start with Bud Pierce. He's the 2016 nominee. And my guess is their campaign would basically say that, look, all roads lead through Bud Pierce is kind of the headline of a memo they distributed in December to major donors, not major donors just of his campaign, but in Oregon. And basically the story is he's the previous nominee. He's got experience. He's running for the office. He's got name ID. He has the ability to self-fund, and all the polling shows him ahead because of that strong name ID, and that none of the other candidates have a shot because of that. So
ahead in the primary, right?
Ahead in the primary, yeah. Nobody has any general election that I'm aware of. And so I think his latest poll, which we published on Catalyst, had him right around 20% in the primary, and everyone else no one else is in double digits, single digits or below. And that was a December poll that they released. So, that ability to self-fund, we don't really know how much he's going to spend, right? I forget what he spent in 2016, but it was pretty significant amount of money. I think it was around $5 million, maybe. Yeah. You don't quote me on that, but wow. So that ability to self-fund obviously matters a lot when you need to buy Portland TV and you need to be able to blanket the state with mail. So I would say, Pierce considers himself the front runner. There isn't a lot of evidence yet to dispute that, at least in terms of polling. So then you kind of move to some of the top challengers, the first-time candidates. You've got Christine Drazan running pretty hot out of the gate with the fundraising, especially. She's the first candidate to eclipse $1 million raised in the Republican primary.
Has she's already raised more than $1 million?
She's already topped $1 million, yeah.
And I think she's got like 800,000 plus on hand, so she hasn't really spent it yet. Some of the candidates are spending a lot of money, but she got in late and still has a lot in the bank.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I'm trying to see, looking for the top packs and fundraising on this cycle. Yeah, so you've got Betsey Johnson raising almost $4 million in this cycle, right? And she spent almost $1 million of it, 899,000. So she's got 3.6 cash on hand. Nick Kristof raised 2.7 this cycle. He spent almost $1 million, but he has 1.7 on hand. And then Tina Kotek raising $1 million, only having spent 250K. So she's sitting on 912 if you include the amount that was in her pack before she declared, right? And then Drazan, who's raised just about the exact amount that Kotek has, about $1 million this year. And then Pulliam, 962,000 raised. Bud Pierce, 921,000 raised. Tobias Read, 871,000 raised. Bridget Barton, 592,000 raised.
So,
but since I would say you talk about Drazan having the momentum on the fundraising side, because since the 1st of January of this year, she's raised $500,000. Next closest is Pulliam at 200. Pierce only 97,000. Bridget hasn't raised anything this year.
Reagan, I have a question. It seems like, I mean, one thing, and we talked about this before on the podcast, maybe it was even on your episode, is that a lot of Republicans are excited about the field this year and feel like we have a pretty good shot in terms of capturing the governor's mansion. Do you see, at least kind of from what you're hearing, like there's a lot of big names who are clearly raising a lot of money, which I imagine probably has some donors basically saying, no, you two should drop out, or, you know, really the candidate has to be Bud or it has to be Drazan because of X. Are you kind of hearing that chatter in the back end? Like, do you think we might see a big name or two basically drop out before the primary day to kind of coalesce around one candidate? Or do you just think it's kind of more of free for all basically? And, you know, there's going to be a bunch of big names in the primary and maybe someone's going to win by 20, you know, with 25, 30% of the vote or whatever.
I think it feels a little bit like a free for all. I don't see anyone getting out. I think there's obviously opportunities for candidates to jump out and then potentially get in with a candidate who has momentum, and then become part of, you know, potentially a list of someone that they draw from for an appointment to head an agency or something like that if they were to win. But I don't think that right now everyone believes they're the best candidate in this primary right now. And so I don't see a lot of people dropping out except for some of the fringe guys. You saw a guy named Jim Huggins who really didn't make a huge impact to the primary out and endorsed Kerry McQuisten. So
I think the problem with that is the most recent example is the presidential race where like Pete Buttigieg and I think like Amy Klobuchar and a few others dropped out right before Super Tuesday, endorsed Joe Biden, and the rest is history. The problem here is the voters pamphlet deadline, the deadline to basically take your name out of the voters pamphlet and off the ballot, I think is mid-March, right?
Yep.
So by mid-March, most people still are going to be able to convince themselves that they have a path to victory. It's not going to be abundantly clear. Like going into Super Tuesday, I think those candidates knew that they weren't going to be the nominee, or it was very unlikely that they would. But I think the problem here is that each one of them will believe that they can win the election still, because March, April, May, 2.5, 3 months is a long enough time theoretically. Although I don't see it that way. I think that's how they will see it.
I think the vote by mail system does have that kind of an impact, right? You don't see candidates take their name off the ballot because there's still a lot of time between when you have to finalize and print those ballots versus when the election is, right? And then I think you also have just the undecided block just stays undecided for so long. The December poll, the Bud Pierce release, so half of Republican primary voters that they surveyed were undecided. That's a huge chunk. And so that leaves a lot of space, like you said, Ben, and like you said, Alex, for someone to just convince themselves that they've got a path to victory. Because look at all these undecided people now. If you don't have any money and you don't have any name ID and you don't have a path to raise any money, you should probably take a look and say, maybe I'm not going to win any of those undecideds, but you can, as a candidate, convince yourself.
Well, this is just totally my guess and opinion, not based on any hard evidence here, but even like the candidates who are at a certain percent, like take Bud Pierce's 20%, that's a soft 20% in my opinion, because that's people who basically remember his name from previous cycles and being like, oh yeah, he was the Republican then, I think I voted for him then. But most of those people probably don't know who Christine Drazan is yet. They haven't seen her TV ads, etc. You can move down the line on other candidates. So I think like the polling basically is more of a name recognition poll than like, this is who I'm committed to. Like, I think it's just still too early for people to make that choice. That being said, in that poll, Stan Pulliam comes in at second at 8%. I think he was the first candidate.
Which is also crazy that second place is
8%, right? And think about this, like I think he's spent quite a bit of money too, because you said he's raised $900K, and I think he's got like $300K or something like that. So a huge percent of his dollars he spent. He was the first candidate in the race. There was a crazy story this week. If you haven't read Willamette Week's coverage, that's probably, they broke the story. I think it was Nigel who broke the story. Yep. And basically there was longstanding rumors that Mayor Pulliam and his wife engaged in an open relationship, an open marriage, and we're part of what is being called a swingers community on social media and in the Portland area. So basically, Nigel calls him, does an interview with him and his wife, and is like, is this true? And they say yes. And that it's like, in the past, it's not happening anymore, and it strengthened their marriage, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a bunch of things to unpack here that I like. It's if you look at, the Oregonian and William Week and whatever, they'll post on social media. And most of the time, if it's, most of the time, if it's a story about like, a candidate for office, it'll get a few engagements, tons of engagements on this story, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
So my first question is, like, you've been working in Republican politics for a long time. You've also worked for like some of this more socially conservative organizations like Oregon Right to Life. Do you think this impacts Pulliam's ability to win some of the social conservative voters and or institutional powers that matter in a Republican primary?
I'd say on the organizational level, I don't think it's going to impact. I think that they're kind of looking pretty squarely. I mean, they supported Donald Trump when he ran in Oregon for re-election. I don't think they endorsed him the first time. I think they endorsed Ted Cruz. So for a group like Oregon Right to Life, I don't think that they're going to, I think they're going to look at it, but I don't think they're going to take that as the totality of who he is. I think they're going to look at a lot of different stuff, and they're going to, give him the benefit of the doubt. And I think that's kind of what they do with all the candidates, right? I don't think they look at anyone as particularly as perfect. I would say anecdotally, I've seen two things on social media in the Republican Facebook groups. I'd say a good chunk of the comments are people just saying, so what, does this impact his ability to govern? And so I think there's a good chunk of people that really believe that. And I think that might be a transformation of the party post-Trump to some extent. And then there were definitely some comments that were people who were saying that this impacted how they felt about him. But I don't know that those people that were ever necessarily voting for him before, right? They might have already been supportive of other candidates. And so they're taking the opportunity to pile on. So I'd say in the short term, it doesn't really impact his campaign all that much. I think it's just whether in the long term, can he keep the momentum with the COVID stuff that he had going, or are other candidates going to kind of come in and take the momentum?
Alex, you worked for Trump on the campaign side at the national level. What do you think?
Yeah, I think I've been pretty consistent across this as it's kind of come out, in the sense of like, there's a couple of things here. One, I don't really think that many people would actually care from a voter level, partially because is one of the other campaigns really going to spend millions of dollars doing TV ads and sending out mailers saying stand engaged in this sort of activity?
Well, if he becomes the front runner, they might.
True. If he becomes the front runner, he probably will. But again, I think Stan can kind of counter that pretty easily in terms of I think that what Trump really showed is that if people just kind of go out and own a lot of their, what other people might consider flaws, that like at least folks on the GOP side are sort of willing to overlook it, kind of on the voter level. Where I think this is going to hurt Stan a lot more on probably, frankly, the more important level for where his campaign is at is like on the donor side of things, because, there's not that many big donors in Oregon. Everybody's hitting them up. And I think basically what the other campaigns can probably say about Stan is like, okay, this may have come out and maybe you don't even think it's that bad, but what else is there hiding behind the curtain? And I think that sort of like mysteriousness is probably more off-putting for big donors who are either more socially conservative or even more establishment, right? In terms of like, okay, this came out of the closet, like what's a little bit deeper under the covers as well. And of course, if Stan doesn't have access to big money, then he can't get out his message, get up his name ID and things like that. So I think that's kind of the overlooked thing in all of this. Like, I mean, again, not that many people actually will probably see this article or even know that this sort of thing will happen, at least in the primary right now. But I think that it's really worrying for him from like the big donor sort of like political back office side of thing.
Let me ask a philosophical question before we move on here. Do you think it should matter? Like, should it matter? Should it be should it be considered relevant for both media and for voters and for institutions to consider whether or not he had like, the reason why I bring it up is like, obviously I'm gay. So there was a time where like being a gay candidate was like the death knell for a politician. Like, you know, people get outed and then they lose or whatever, which is not the same thing. But it's in the same zip code as what happened to Stan. So I guess I'm curious if you, either of you, have thoughts on like, should this be relevant? Should this be part of the discourse? As two married men.
Go for it, Mr. Political Analysis.
Well, yeah, being straight and have only engaged in straight things, it's difficult to say for sure. But I would have to say that I don't know what's the right answer for that. I think generally my view is like voters should just get the most information possible. And so if the media is going to cover something, it's up to the candidate whether or not they want to respond to it. And that's up to the voters to decide what they want to do with it. And that's just kind of the way we are. I think we kind of live in this culture now where pretty much everything is out there now. You can't really do anything, especially online, without having the idea that it's going to come out somehow. Right. So it's just, you know, candidates will have to continue to be careful and or as upfront as they can be if they want to make sure it's not going to end up being a liability for them. But yeah, I mean, once you become a public official, it seems like your life isn't really that much, isn't private anymore. So I think that's just kind of where we're at this point.
Yeah, and I honestly think it. Well, I mean, philosophically is one thing, but like I think it just matters less and less as the years go on. And the sort of generation that I'm the most afraid for in terms of engaging with politics is not actually millennials, because I think we just kind of missed the crux a little bit in privacy. But like when Zoomers, and by me referring to Zoomers, I think it's people who were born in 98 through 2010.
Yeah.
It's going to be wild of what comes out about them because they're like engaging on TikTok. They're all over Snapchat. They're all over Instagram, literally all of the time.
From the time they're in middle school, right? Like their whole developmental years are, you know, stuck online forever, basically.
Yeah, and I remember there was like some sort of singer or something, and she said something racist that she had to apologize for, and she was literally 9 years old when she said this, and she was like, "Oh my gosh," I'm like, "So sorry for like making this like racial slur," and I was like, yeah, like 9-year-olds are just stupid and like say stupid stuff. Like that's bound to happen. But I mean, all of this stuff is just living permanently now. So I agree with Reagan that like, I think basically kind of as everything just starts to come out about anybody who runs for office, that it's not like it doesn't matter, but I think it starts to matter a little bit less over time, right? Whereas like if something like this came out in like 2005, like you're probably just done. But I think even in 2020, which is, you know, literally only 15, 16, 2021, 15, 16 years later, like it just starts to matter less and less.
The interesting thing about this too is like, if the equivalent of this would have happened in 2005 or whatever, the response from Pulliam would be like, I am so sorry. I made a mistake. Like, you know, I failed my family. I hope that voters will forgive me. But that is not the message this time. The message this time was like, yeah, I did this and it was good for my marriage and I'm glad that we did it. The thing that, I mean, this is like, we're getting, I don't want to get too deep here, but he denies in the Willamette Week article being bisexual, which was one of the claims of whoever it was that like leaked this. It seemed like it was someone who was in the community with him, although that isn't necessarily true. It could have been anyone. But then that would bring a whole new dynamic, right? Like if it comes out that like he is bisexual or LGBT in some way, like I think that is a very different thing to a primary. Like I still believe there's a lot of Republican voters who are not comfortable with LGBT issues. And so that's what I was kind of like, you all know much more about the right than I do, but I think of the three of us, think that there's most likely to be some harm among voters from this revelation because of, although Trump, I guess, is a great counter argument. So anyway, any closing thoughts on Stan before we move on?
Alex, do you remember the guy in South Carolina who made a comeback tour from like governor or something after he like had a mistress and then ran for Congress and won?
Mark Sanford, yeah.
Legend.
And the reason he got defeated, I think the most recent time was not because of any of his past misdoings, but because he was like not enough with Donald Trump
He was
on some issues or
anti-Trump.
something.
Yeah,
He was
he
an
anti-Trump.
anti-Trump small tax guy or something like that. I mean, like, I think that's kind of the new place we are in the Republican primary, right? Where it's like, yeah, we're technically the social conservative party, but that really just means like abortion and then the other like social issues, which is kind of more now kind of shifted to immigration and other issues like that, right? It's like, don't change the way society is anymore. Social conservatives, not like, I don't know what a better way to describe it, but it's, I think a lot of it's more abortion and then related to immigration policy and stuff like that. Has a lot less to do with marriage policy. And I don't know that, like you said, Ben, I think there's still a lot of voters that aren't personally comfortable with that or with where the country is, but they're not voting based on it very much anymore.
That's a fair point.
So, right, because you don't see marriage and traditional marriage at the top of polls anymore. And so I think we'd say kind of that issue is over, but those voters are still there and maybe they have the same opinions about marriage. So maybe that's where it would impact Pulliam, is if that someone's, keeping that issue at the top of their list and just not telling pollsters about it, right? I didn't have a chance to get into the article with them, but when I briefly touched base with them about like why do they think they're going to win, they basically said they're the only campaign that isn't afraid to be conservative. And so he's talking about how there was fraud in the election and how we need to end the fraud in the election, and how he said, we may not know the outcome of the 2020 election, which is pretty close to the talking points that the Trump campaign has.
Which I don't like. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to, we could probably go on for that. To me was the most the idea that this continues to be a talking point without any evidence, despite the fact that they lose all the court cases, all the audits that are done by the Republicans, like turn up nothing, that it continues to be like, I guess that's a gamble that Stan is making, that voters will respond to that. Like, is there evidence that suggests that actually is going to matter for primary voters?
If you ask a state Republican legislator what their county Republicans want to talk about at their party meetings, it's election fraud. And so I think that there's a group of people who are obviously very active who care about that. And I think that that's informed where the Pulliam campaign has gone in their conservative lane here. I don't know. I don't think you've seen voters in Oregon really handle that in a Republican primary before. So if this is kind of, I guess we'll see, this governor's primary may be a referendum on the Trump election in terms of, you have a couple of candidates probably. I haven't talked to the McQuisten campaign, so I'm not sure where they're at. The Barton campaign has said there's election fraud and we need to get to the bottom of it. So you have the camps that are, and then you have, I think, Drazan said Biden won. I don't think Pierce was available to comment, but I would guess he's more in the Biden won camp than the fraud camp.
He did come back and say that Biden won.
Okay, I didn't see that. So yeah, so I think you might have a kind of a referendum there, and I think that's what they're saying about not afraid to be conservative, right? They're not afraid to go right where Trump is in the party, and not afraid to talk about Trump. Whereas you see most Republicans in Oregon not dealing with him because he hasn't ever been popular, except for one clout poll where they said that he was going to beat Hillary Clinton in 2016 in Oregon.
Whoa, hey, Reagan,
which is completely made up.
According to a recent poll, Trump is actually more popular than Kate Brown. So, the MAGA 2024 in Oregon.
Right. And maybe that's what Pulliam is banking on, is basically now Trumpism is more popular than Kate Brown. And so if he makes it a referendum on, I'm Stan Pulliam and I support Trump policies, and Tina Kotek or Nick Kristof or whoever is Kate Brown, then maybe I can win. Especially with Betsey Johnson, they are kind of in the middle, messing around.
Okay, so that's a little bit of state of the race on the Republican side. The Democratic side, I also find fascinating this cycle. So the basic dynamic is you've got Speaker Tina Kotek, who has resigned from her position as Speaker to run full-time for governor. You've got State Treasurer Tobias Read, who obviously gets to keep his position as treasurer, and I believe he's midterm as well, but also termed out, so he can't run for re-election in 2 years. And then you've got the wild card, which is Nick Kristof. So the major points for us to discuss here. So obviously, Shemia Fagan, the Oregon Secretary of State, has ruled that Kristof is ineligible to run for governor based on residency status. That is before the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will make the final decision about whether he gets to be on the ballot or off. I have no inside knowledge or any idea how that's going to fall. Do either of you have any sense of conventional wisdom on how to approach this? I've heard basically two schools of thought. One is that the Supreme Court is most likely, and Reagan, you might have actually said this, the Supreme Court is most likely to uphold what the agency has done if they've followed their processes or something like that. And the second being the Supreme Court is likely to defer to voters and have a broad interpretation like past secretaries of state in terms of if we're not sure if they're eligible or not, we'll defer to inclusion and let voters to decide. What is your take on the Kristof situation? Reagan, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would agree with, I believe you did represent my position, which is basically that it seems like on political issues, they're going to defer to the legislature. They're deferring to agencies on issues like this, which are basically political questions, right? To some extent.
It does.
It doesn't feel like a political question. I understand that. But I think the other thing you have to, the question that just popped into my mind is, would Shemia Fagan handle this differently if this were a BIPOC candidate with the exact same residency background? And I think that the answer is yes. And so I think that, I don't know if that'll inform the court or how they handle it. I don't think that Nick Kristof is, trying to trudge up trying to find anything in his heritage that isn't white. But I think it is, you're right. It's basically like, is the agency right in denying him, or do we just defer to them in their interpretation of the rules, because that's mostly their job? Or do we just say the goal of this is just to be open, and that it's kind of silly that we have this, really hard and fast requirement of 3-year residency?
Which I actually don't. So Kristof's legal team wrote a very detailed submission to the Supreme Court, and I believe one of the not allegations, but one of their statements of fact is that the origins of this residency requirement are in fact like racist and xenophobic, and that it's a constitutional provision that I think was created, if not at the Constitutional Convention, long before today, when we were a pretty deeply racist state. But on the other hand, does that matter if you're doing a legal interpretation of what the Constitution says in terms of eligibility? To me, or Titus, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even going to pretend like I understand the legal semantics, because we can obviously all do fake commentary about some things, but that's one thing where I'm just like, I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen.
Refreshing.
Someone who admits they don't know anything about something. But I will say, I really hope that he is allowed to be included. I think that, and again, I understand the trade-off of saying, we're basically saying, yes, these are the requirements. We're sorry in terms of like, you can't get on the ballot because like, this is what the requirements are. But I also just think it's ridiculous that, right, like someone who is, I wouldn't even say, I guess you could call him a national figure. Maybe that's not right, because like, I don't think your average person knows who Nick Kristof is, but like a lot of very,
figure. Yeah,
I think it's personally fair to call him a national figure. I even think it's fair to call him an international figure in some ways.
Yeah.
He's raised like almost $3 million. I think his last report was like 2.7 or whatever. He's probably raised more money since. Like, I think it's insane that, someone owns property in the state. Like, I just think it's insane, basically, like that someone like that couldn't be included. Or like, frankly, anyone, if they just want to decide to run for governor and that. I just think that voters should be able to decide those issues on their own. And like, if they don't think he's a resident, they're not going to elect him. And maybe they don't even care, right? They just think his policies or his leadership that he's putting forward are better than the other candidates. So I really hope he's allowed to be included.
His brief put forward a lot of scenarios by which you would want to defer to someone who's a teenager who's spending time between his mom and his dad's house, someone who's caregiving for their parent or some other older person that's important to them, right? But that's not his situation. His situation is he had an excellent job at the New York Times. He owns a farm in Yamhill County. And so I think that the idea of the 3-year residency is probably not one that most people care about, but the circumstances by which he's attempting to avoid or skirt it or get past it is preventing him from doing that. Because you saw the quotes from Tobias Read, which was basically like, he's a rich guy from New York trying to muscle his way into the Democratic primary. And when you say rich New Yorker, everyone goes Donald Trump. And so it was like they were attacking him for basically taking this
I didn't even
Trumpist
think about
position.
that. That was really smart messaging.
No, because he basically said he's attacking our election officials and he's a rich guy from New York. Like his point was he's acting like Donald Trump. He just didn't say it, right? And so like I think by the circumstances that Nick Kristof is trying to get into this primary with his wild card hair is fascinating. And I think it's really interesting problem for basically Democrats to grapple with. Republicans have no influence. You've got literally all Kate Brown appointed Supreme Court judges, the Democrat secretary. No, literally all. The last one who was appointed by Kitzhaber just resigned. She has appointed the entire Oregon state. She's appointed the entire Oregon State Supreme Court. All 7 members.
That is bonkers.
Or 9
members.
members.
Can you imagine that on the federal level? Like what?
Like literally Trump appointed every single judge. All of them.
9-0 decisions, man. It was unanimous.
Well, I want to thank you both for not referring to the New York Times as the failing New York Times. That showed tremendous restraint and kindness from you both.
Hey, they just bought Wordle, so I have to be nice to them so they don't ruin my favorite game.
Okay, so
well, Ben, what are you hearing on kind of the Democratic side of things, or what's your general take on what's happening?
I mean, everyone's waiting to see what happens with the Supreme Court case. Literally decides everything, essentially, right? Like if Kristof is in the race, I don't know if it's fair to call him a favorite. I think Kotek is still probably the favorite, but I don't think anyone would be surprised if he wins, right? When you have that kind of money, and the narrative he's got, and I think like you can imagine a deeply competitive campaign where he could, like, there's definitely people who think Kotek still beats him, but I think a lot of people would assume he would probably get second place. Now, if he's out of the race, I think it's the best news is for Tina Kotek, because I don't think Treasurer Read is competing for some of the endorsements and dollars that Kotek and Kristof might be, which Kotek candidly is winning most. Like Kotek got in the last couple of weeks has been endorsed by Planned Parenthood, Pro-Choice Oregon, the Mother PAC, and every labor union that's weighed in so far, except for UFCW, which is the largest private sector labor union, which went with Kristof. So with Kristof out of the race, it really opens things up for Kotek, and importantly, probably means that she doesn't have to spend as much money in a primary, which could be actually a very big deal when you're talking about Betsey Johnson and Christine Drazan potentially, or Bud Pearson in general. It also perhaps creates a lane for Treasurer Read to re-enter if there's like, to the extent that there are Kristof voters, if they're disaffected and feel like he was treated unfairly, or if they buy into Kristof's narrative, they likely will find more commonality with Tobias Read than they will with Tina Kotek, just because Kotek's been in leadership. I mean, interestingly, Read has actually gone increasingly negative over the last couple of weeks. The quote that Reagan was referring to is this is from one of his newsletters. The Secretary of State, this is a quote, "The Secretary of State issued the ruling and Kristof has every right to challenge it. However, attacking the process with conspiracies is beyond the pale. I can think of another out of touch New Yorker who does the same thing." So that is what he's saying about Kristof. And then about Kotek, we talked on this podcast with Angela Wilhelms about the Intel manufacturing plant going to Ohio. Tobias Read wrote an op-ed that essentially lays the blame on Tina Kotek for not keeping Intel in Oregon. So fascinating to see what will happen. But I think like really the most important, when this election is over, the most important moment will have been this Supreme Court decision to determine the election.
I have one question about you on the Dem side, which I thought was so interesting from Treasurer Read. Was I don't know if it was just a press release or if it was an email, but when he attacked the Portland Public Schools Union for a 4-day work week or whatever, to me, I had read that and I was like, because I basically think that if Tobias is to win the primary, that like the election's basically over. Like I just think he's relatively moderate on the right issues, or at least like messaging moderately. Like I just don't see anyone on the Republican side beating him. But that to me seemed like a death knell in the Democratic primary. It was like a shot directly at the teachers unions, which of course everybody in the GOP is like the teachers unions are like literally the most powerful thing across the entire country.
It's more complicated. It's more complicated.
Oh, no. I know it's more complicated than that. I'm just saying from like our perspective.
Yeah.
But well, from your perspective as a Democrat, was that shocking? Because to me, it was particularly shocking.
I don't think shocking is the right word, because if you look at what Treasurer Read is trying to do is, I mean, he's trying to tap into the COVID anxiety among parents. He's trying to paint himself as someone who is going to have a vision for a post-COVID Oregon. That being said, I think what it told me was that he's not competing for the OEA endorsement. He basically presumed that he wasn't going to win that endorsement, because I think you're right. I think after that, it was probably a non-starter for most folks in OEA. Yeah, so that I'll just leave it there. Reagan, you have some misinformation, correct? What did I screw up?
No, it was me. So I said that
Okay.
Kate Brown has appointed all the judges. So I thought that Thomas Balmer had left the bench, but he had not. So Martha Walters was appointed by Kulongowski, and Thomas Balmer was appointed by Kitzhoffer. So she's appointed 5 of the 7, I think is the number.
Okay.
This podcast is rife with fake news.
But interesting. So did Kate Brown nominate Martha Walters as Chief Justice?
Yes, because it's a 6-year term, and then you can't re-up, I think is what I read. So you have to have a new Chief Justice every 6 years.
Oh, the Chief
I
Justice,
think that's what it was.
The Chief Justice's term. We need some live fact checking here.
I'm checking out right now. By the way, before we finish up, I need to pivot back to the Republican primary.
Yeah.
For a couple of things. So we had over the weekend, there was a Oregon Republican Party Central Committee meeting. And basically what it is, the chair, the vice chair, and the delegates from every county Republican Party. And we only have 34 operating counties. I think there's a couple counties that don't have functioning Republican parties, like Lake County and another county.
It's Multnomah County, actually, I think. I'm just kidding.
Well, they have a split delegation. They claim that one delegation is legit and the other delegation is not. It's really complicated. But just like how we have 2 libertarian parties in the state of Oregon that both claim to be the only real libertarian party. Anyway, so at this meeting of, maybe 111 Republican delegates, on the agenda was whether or not we'd open our primary to non-affiliated voters. And so what we would do is we'd allow a process whereby a non-affiliated person can, according to the law, or the way the resolution was worded, is make a written request for a ballot. So presumably the Secretary of State creates a form that allows a non-affiliated voter to request a Republican ballot. Or actually, I think it was at the county level. So the local
Which, by the way, no one would do that.
So that was basically
number.
So, and that was basically the argument that happened. They said, oh, this would be basically an olive branch, is what Dallas Hurd, the chair of the Oregon Republican Party, called it to non-affiliated voters. And the response was basically that a lot of voters thought that if they wanted to vote, if non-affiliated voters want to vote Republican, they can just change their party, which is true. You can go online and switch your party. And so it was voted down. And then after that, Dallas Hurd apparently requested that the Oregon Republican Party basically release him via resolution from the chairmanship in order to run for governor. And I was told that it was basically that he was requesting that the 78% that elected him to the chairmanship, that he get at least that percentage in order to, show that the party supports him for governor.
Wait, sorry, Reagan, just to confirm something you had said.
Yeah.
He put forward this resolution. It was not someone else.
He may have requested someone else, or someone else brought the motion. I don't have all of the exact details in front of me, but basically,
he did support it though.
Yeah. He was basically saying,
okay.
Look, I would like to be a candidate for governor, and I want the support of the Oregon Republican Party faithful, right? And
wow. Okay.
It seemed like basically after he brought the non-affiliated primary resolution up, that the room had essentially turned on him. And so they were not really interested in hearing him make his pitch to run for governor. And since he was just elected as the chair, and this is his first term, right? So there was a lot of pushback. So they didn't even vote on the resolution. They tabled it. And so they're not going to move forward with it. So what I don't know is if Dallas Hurd is actually a Republican candidate for governor or not. That really remains to be seen. There was an image circulating through Republican primary or Republican groups on Facebook attacking him for having missed a lot of votes over the last session on there was a pro-life bill. There was some bills about veterans, and there were some bills about cops that he either voted no or missed the votes on. And so I think there are people that were expecting him to enter the primary, but maybe expecting that he was going to get that support from the Central Committee. So we really don't know if Dallas is a candidate or not. And he has said on multiple occasions, I've heard him say this in large groups, that he is not very tech savvy. So he doesn't really communicate via his Facebook page very often. He's a very one-to-one communicator. He doesn't really have a communications team on the state Senate campaign side. So he only has the Oregon Republican Party communications team and then his staff in the legislature. So like it could be a while before we know if he actually intends to run or not. So it's super interesting, just kind of watch that unfold.
So my first reaction to that is that would be terrible news for Stan Pulliam, because if Stan Pulliam's goal is to like own the Trump lane, that would be exactly where Dallas tries to situate himself, I'm sure.
Well, and if they take those talking points from that image that was going out, if that's the attack line that they're using, I think Dallas is basically going to say he's the only person that cares for working men and women. Like he says this all the time. Like he's even intimated that a lot of the Republicans in Salem are bought and sold by the major corporations and interest groups, and that they don't care about working people, right? So if Dallas is saying he's the only true conservative, and that image that, you know, is attacking him on cops and veterans and not being pro-life enough, I think the point of a Pulliam or another campaign like Kerry McQuisten would basically be that he's bad at being the only true conservative in the race, right? So I think it'd be super interesting to see him enter, but I think it would mix up the primary a lot. And you know, I don't know if how big is that conservative lane, right? If you look at the CD2 primary, the conservative, you know, the moderate lane was pretty small. If you look at Bueller as kind of the primary moderate, and maybe Atkinson a little bit as an adjacent moderate, and the conservative, if you're talking Crumpacker and Bentz, was a pretty big chunk of that primary. But you didn't have anything really happen west of I-5 in that primary, right? So you do have a lot of maybe the more liberal Republican voters.
I also wonder, Bentz is an interesting figure because Bentz is kind of like a Rorschach test. I feel like a moderate could see him as like, oh, he's a deal maker, he gets things done, like, and he obviously made a strong pitch as a conservative. So that's an interesting, but there's no one, maybe does anyone have that kind of a crossover appeal?
So I have a take that's different than both of you that I think that you'll both disagree with on Dallas. And I take some of this. I take some of this actually, Ben, from when he came on our podcast, was like, Dallas is really interesting in the way that he speaks, because you're totally right, Reagan. Like he did harp on that working class piece a lot, and that like a lot of both the Dems and the GOP are paid for by big business. Like it is actually, I don't even want to call it Trumpian in the sense of like he's just like trying to imitate Trump, but like I think he actually really does believe that, and that people find it authentic. But the other thing he tried to show too, and I think he's sort of, I mean, it sounds like he kind of showed this too with the resolution, is like Dallas has a big thing for like unity and like unifying the state. And I don't necessarily think, you know, someone in Ben's district would see it the same way, that like that's what Dallas is trying to do with his policies. But like, I'm actually curious if he would run a little bit in that lane too, in terms of like, I'm going to bring people from across the aisle to like support like a clear working class conservative vision for Oregon. I think you two will probably both disagree with that, but like he talks like that a lot, which I find really interesting, because most people say like, oh, he's the most bombastic guy ever and all this sort of stuff. But like a lot of his language is about like unity and unifying and like one direction forward, despite what you might think kind of like in terms of the actual.
Well, wait. His language is like that sometimes, but he's also the guy who goes to some of these rallies and calls the people he works with fools and morons. I think he's used the word traitor. He gets kicked off the floor of the Senate because he's the only one in the building who won't wear a mask. Like, that's
not true. There's other people in the building that didn't wear masks this most recent session, but
he's the high profile. Other legislators?
I saw a tweet that said that Werner Reschke popped in to vote without a mask.
Okay,
From a
well,
journalist, but he's the one that makes the most big. He makes a big deal about it, right? But
right.
so here's the other thing. Not to cut you off too much, Ben, but I
No,
agree
no.
with you, Alex, in the sense that like his goal is not. He's not a guy that is purely partisan. He's not R versus D, right? Because the non-affiliated thing really proves that he wants to get as many crossover people. He is very populist, I think. And so if you're somebody in a position of power, he's almost preset on hating you and who you are and everything you're about. And if you run a major corporation or have influence at a major corporation, he's going to dislike you as well. I think, I had a lobbyist tell me, or I had heard that there were lobbyists saying that there was a rumor that Dallas Hurd was moving to Texas. And I immediately knew it was wrong because he doesn't talk to anybody in the lobby. Lobbyists know they can't get anywhere with him. So for the most part. So I think that what you see is him attacking the leadership and the elected and the powerful people in Oregon in an attempt to rally the people who are the everyday Oregonians. And so he doesn't really care if they're Democrats or they're liberal or if they're Republican or if they're conservative, if they're non-affiliated, and they're all over the place. He just wants their vote to throw out the bums, essentially, right? And so that's all of his messaging. So I think, Alex, to some extent, you're right. He's not purely partisan. He's focused on, he sees basically everyone who, I think you get along with Karl Marx in the sense that he sees everyone who's running the state as oppressors, and that, the workers need to rise up. And I don't know. I don't think that he's a big seize the production guy, but, at least throw off the shackles of capitalism.
All right. It is, we've taken a lot of time. There's a lot to cover in the governor's race.
Yep.
Okay, so for the final section of our conversation, we want to talk about the Betsey Johnson dynamic, the general election dynamic. So to get us started here, I want to read some tweets from John Horvick, who is one of the top pollsters in Oregon. He works for DHM, and they just released this poll this week. And here's a few highlights. In a generic ballot test among just Democrats and Republicans, or with just a Democrat and just a Republican on the ballot, a Democrat leads by 9 points, about what you would expect in Oregon. When Johnson is added, without any description of her, she is third at 11%. The Democrat maintains their advantage in first place by exactly 9 points. When presented with a description of Johnson from her campaign website, so how Betsey describes herself, Johnson catapults into first place in the poll with 30%. The generic Democrat is in second at 24%. The Republican is in third at 17%. And then 30% of the electorate doesn't know what they would do. Fair point. 30% of the electorate who doesn't know what they would do. When voters are provided a statement that Johnson is pro-choice and often voted with Democrats on social issues, and often
is considered a centrist.
right, and often voted with Republicans on economic and environmental issues, she falls back into third place where she started, Democrats at 29, Republicans to 22, and Johnson to 21%. And then finally, when provided with a statement about who is funding Johnson's campaign, large donors, the results catapult back to where they started in the first place. 30% Democrats, 22% Republicans, 17% for Johnson. Reagan, help us make sense of this poll. What does it mean? What do you take away from it?
So when I was a consultant and I paid for polling like this, it cost anywhere between $10,000 and $15,000. And for the low rate of $7,500, I could tell you that Betsey Johnson would be super popular if you gave her a great bio, and that if you said she was owned by corporations, no one would vote for her, and that she draws equally from Republicans and Democrats running a centrist campaign. Goodness gracious. I mean, some of the work that DHM does is good, but this is a piece of garbage on paper to me.
I actually have a very different take from this, which is basically like, and this is what I've drafted in the liftoff, although your harshness, maybe I need to scale it back a little bit. The reason why I think this is important is because it perfectly tells you, I mean, you're right in that this wasn't novel beforehand, but it confirms some assumptions, which is basically like it provides the playbook for how these three groups of parties, for lack of a better term, will be framing the election and will be framing the candidates the election. and it shows what will happen depending on who wins the narrative battle, which has to do with money, which has to do with how compelling the message is, etc. So yeah, in some ways it's confirming what I think most of us already thought we knew, but I think it is like, so if I'm Betsey Johnson, I guess my takeaway from the poll is like, well, I'm going to need to raise way more money than everybody else, so my message drowns everyone else out. And I guess that is probably the practical usage of the poll for her end. I'm not sure if I'm a Democrat. I think the way I've been framing it is like, if I'm a Democrat running in a three-way race with Betsey and say Christine Drazan, like you basically say Democrat in color votes like this, and then in black and white, here are the things that Betsey and Christine Drazan agree on. And then the Republican does the reverse, right? The Republican says, here's what I do, and here's all the things that Betsey and Tina Kotek agree on. And that's kind of basically, the poll is basically saying whoever is loudest and whoever's message resonates most strongly with voters wins. So,
except I think, I'm still a skeptic that Republicans win the gubernatorial election. But I will say this. Looking at this again, I would say that I think that Republicans have a small advantage, because you can still point to the fact that Betsey Johnson, until this race, was a lifelong Democrat. And I think that matters. And you can point to say, oh, on social issues, locked in, right? And you can just avoid some of the environmental and economic stuff. And I mean, she votes with Democrats pretty high percentage of the time, because most of the stuff that's moving, she's not voting against, because if she was killing it, Republicans would have already defeated it. They just need her additional vote, right? And that's what happened a lot. I worked the legislature in the 2013 session, 16 Democrats, one of whom is Betsey Johnson, 14 Republicans. And so as long as Republicans locked up and agreed with Betsey Johnson, that bill was dead. And they brought a couple things to the floor that they killed, but most of it was dead before it even hit the floor, right? And so the actual voting percentages, because we have a system where the leadership only brings bills up that they either A, know are going to pass, or B, need to get a vote on because the interest group or whoever is bringing it really wants to make this point, right? Which is when you have a bill, that's the only reason you have a bill that's dead come to the floor, is if they want to get people on the record on it to go kill them in some campaigns next year, right? And so you really have very few votes where Johnson breaks with Democrats. So you can point to her voting record, percentage basis, and the fact that she's a lifelong Democrat. And you can really drive home the idea that she's a Democrat, and say that you're on the stage with two Democrats. And I think that gives the Republican nominee, and in my general conversations with these gubernatorial campaigns, they admit it allows them to be a little more freely conservative, having what they call essentially two Democrats in the race. And so I think you'll see one of the no matter who the nominee is, it'll be the most conservative Republican campaign in history because of Betsey Johnson being there.
Interesting. Titus, what do you make of the fact that in literally no scenario, according to DHM, do Republicans earn more than 22% of the vote in this poll?
Very sad. Very, very sad.
But would DHM have been right about the Virginia governor's race? They would have had Terry McAuliffe on top, and you know it then.
I actually don't know.
I mean, look,
I think every pollster except for the Trafalgar group or whatever it is, that is the kind of Trumpian pollster had McAuliffe ahead, right? So I want to say their house effect's probably a little pro-Dem.
I mean, look, the thing about this is, and one of my bosses is probably my old boss, not current boss, was one of the most influential pollsters, GOP consulting companies in the country. And the one thing he said about polling that always stuck with me is like, polling is a snapshot in time, and that is it, right? And we are, 9 months out from election day today. So, I mean, I think that the polls are fun because they create some chatter, but I don't really think they mean anything until we know who the actual candidates are. I think that the bigger thing for Betsey is which we haven't talked about yet, but is the Phil Knight factor. So just the other day, or maybe a week ago, because Reagan said, quote, "How did you not know that happened, Alex?" Phil Knight wrote a $250,000 check to the Johnson campaign. And if anyone on this podcast doesn't know who Phil Knight is, I would be shocked. But Phil Knight is the founder of Nike. Or co-founder, I guess. And I was just looking because I remember I looked up his net worth before a couple of years ago, and it was like 19 billion. So Phil Knight's net worth right now is at $54.3 billion, which, if I'm not mistaken, is very close to the number that Michael Bloomberg was at when he ran for president.
let me just one fun note. According to Oregon campaign finance law, Phil Knight could give $50 billion to Betsey Johnson, and it would be totally legal.
Yeah, so I'm saying, right, like if the factor here, I feel like a lot of people think this race is going to come out to be like, and I was just trying to think of other governors' races that sort of played out like this, and the first one that came to mind was Minnesota when Jesse Ventura became president with the Reform Party, which I had no idea that was the case. That's Pat Buchanan being in the same party as Jesse Ventura's bananas, but the 2000s were crazy. But like, you know, my sort of question is like, has Phil Knight had enough? And if Betsey looks like she's viable, is he going to write $100 million check or a $200 million check?
He's not going to write. He would not write anywhere near that. But so I think so. Let's
no. But I'm saying like he has the financial capacity to do that, and that is a real possibility. I feel like $50 million. Like it could happen. It's just what I'm saying.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second, because Reagan, you probably have some historical memory that I am missing here. But Kitzhaber has supported both Democrats, or excuse me, Knight has supported both Democrats and Republicans, including Governor John Kitzhaber in his 2014 reelect. I believe he gave to Dudley. I believe he gave to Bueller. But in each of those times, I think he's maxed out at like I think the most he gave was probably Bueller, and it was like what, 1 or 2 million. Do you know?
Yeah, so
Reagan?
the media has a lot of problems covering campaign finance reform. They're pretty bad at it because they focus on the size of individual checks. And I think the largest check he wrote was $500K, but his total investment in Bueller, I think, was 2.5 in hard dollars and another 2.5 through the Republican Governors Association or something like that. So
that's right.
5.
Okay.
And that's what I recall. They also pointed out that he backed a Dudley who lost, Kitzhaber who resigned, and Bueller who lost. So maybe there's a Phil Knight curse happening.
I don't think that's a thing.
And you're right, Ben, you were about to say something about diminishing returns. He doesn't need to write $100 million check. Oregon's media market is too small. They can't sustain that kind of spending. There isn't enough ad inventory to buy. But I think
he definitely could on digital though. I mean, their consultants could find a gajillion.
But I'm saying it might be 10 million at like, I think so actually, Reagan, if you're Phil Knight, what do you need to know or see to determine whether you're going all in? Because I think you framed this before we started the episode. It's like $250,000 is like sticking your toe in. It is not saying I'm going to do what it takes to make sure you win this election. So how are you thinking about the contribution and what it means, and what, if you were advising Phil Knight, like what does he need to see?
Well, if I'm Phil Knight and I read this DHM poll, I'm seeing that the only way is, like you said, to win is to just basically it's flood the zone. It's just to say you won't see any Dem or Republican advertising. We're buying so many ads. But I think that if I were to look at that poll and understand the kind of partisan landscape we live in, I don't see a path for her to win, because it basically says she only wins if voters have perfect information. Like Betsey Johnson becomes the state media and only allows pro Betsey Johnson ads. And like, that's just not going to happen. Like, I think we're in enough of a partisan era, and the non-affiliated voters that she's going to rely on aren't going to turn out at the rate she wants. And that even when you add her against, by the way, they only tested her against a generic Dem and a generic Republican. So there's no strong affinity for Republicans to their candidate or Democrats to their candidate. And she appears to draw equally from both of them. Right. And then pick up, maybe some swing voters. And so, the only way that matters is if she's taking 15% from each party and then swing voters. But right now it looks like she's taking 5 to 10%, and that's not enough to win. And anecdotally, a lot of the big fans of her are people who have worked in the legislature, who are kind of pro-business, basically. If you're a pro-business lobbyist, you're a pro-business organization. You don't have to be a Republican, but some of them are, right? They're all the biggest kind of fans of Betsey Johnson, right? And if you walked in and presented them an independent running for governor, they would laugh you out of their office and say, none of my clients, none of my organizations, none of my people are donating to you because independents can't win. But a lot of them are violating those general rules when they talk about Betsey Johnson, and I don't know if they're advising their clients or their organizations to give to her, but I just don't see Betsey as the type of person that's going to break through the partisanship and be able to beat the line. Essentially, I think that she is the best possible independent candidate, maybe, that you could recruit, but she doesn't have high name ID to start with, and so I don't think most Oregon voters have an affinity for her. And at least the people who were voting for Chris Dudley kind of thought they really liked the basketball player, and so you like, yeah, or Kristof with the the smart guy, like, she has a reputation, but it's actually in a pretty small orbit. And those people broke out. The people who have that star power ran outside that orbit, especially with Dudley and with Kristof kind of occupying different sections of that type of an orbit. But I just don't see it. I could be proven wrong, and Betsey Johnson as governor would be better than the generic Democrat, right? As a Republican, but I really don't see it as a legitimate thing.
Titus, what do you think?
It's hard because crazier things have happened, but I mean, also I just feel like looking at past examples of when something like this has happened just don't really apply to today, just because I agree with Reagan. I think that the politics are just so much different. I'm just really curious to see how the different, if this, let's say it is like a Kotek versus Betsey versus, I don't know, a Drazan, of like, what are the specific issues that candidates are going to try to basically brand themselves with, I don't know, because I've heard it from both directions from the GOP side. Some people have told me like, oh, with Betsey being in, we have absolutely no chance. And then some people say, this is the godsend basically that we've been waiting it for. But I feel like that the issues of like what the candidates are running on haven't really actually come to light yet. And I just don't know if like Betsey's going to be able to find something that, as Reagan said, kind of helps her bring above that partisan divide. So I think if she can find whatever that specific issue is, and honestly, maybe it's COVID stuff and maybe it's like school closures or whatever. Who knows if that will still be issues coming up, by election day. I think that they probably will. But yeah, I just don't know if there's like that golden issue that she can sort of run on to be able to pull people from both sides and like really make that the kind of execution point of her campaign. So, but there's a lot of time to go before November. So, who the heck knows what's going to, like, some crazy thing could pop up in June, July, August, or whatever, like has happened in campaigns in the past. So I think it's still just too early to tell, but
there's a reason they call it an October surprise, although October might be too late in Oregon, given our vote by mail system. All right. Well, we are a little over time. So I think with that, we're going to wrap up. Reagan, you've been down this road before, but you actually do have some things that you should shout out. Can you first tell us, is the candidate tracker updated and ready for people to look at it? And if so, how can they find it?
I updated it as of last week. So you can go to reaganknopp.net. That's KNOPP. And then I have a button on the homepage and in the navigation that can get you the candidate tracker. So I have it updated as of February 4th. So I worked on it on Friday. So it's as up to date as I can get it, basically. There's one source I didn't go to that I need to go back and double check, but I think most of them are pretty much up to date. So yeah, I worked pretty hard on this because it's just impossible to find a list of people running for office because they never file when they are declaring, and some of them form fundraising packs before they actually declare, and so you can actually, and some of them even change their Facebook page names before they announce it, so you can actually find out that they're running before they're ready to announce it. But in the event, try to keep track of that. It's on my newly updated website, so you can go there and hate my modern design. So
Titus.
Well, great. Well, thank you for that, Reagan. And everybody, thank you so much for listening. I will say, if you've gotten this far listening to the podcast, you have to go check us out on YouTube, because Ben literally looks like the guys from Blue's Clues right now. I kid you not. He literally looks exactly like, what was it name again? Steve from Blue's Clues. Let the record show, Titus sent me a private message on the Zoom chat saying, hey, let me close. And I thought he was going to say like, something to Reagan or a shout out of some kind, but it was because I'm wearing a blue and green striped shirt that vaguely looks like Steve from Blue's Clues. So this is what the people want. So we're glad to give it to you. So yeah, everybody, thanks again. Definitely go check us out on YouTube. As we said, we're posting all the videos on there, and we're hoping to start cutting up important clips at some point of kind of different issues the candidates are talking about and things like that. Definitely information that you should know if you haven't listened to all of our episodes. So go check us out. Go subscribe on YouTube. Make sure to give us 5 stars if your platform does allow it. We are so close to having 65-star ratings on Apple Podcasts. So if you have an iPhone, please give us 5 stars. We greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, Reagan, give us 5 stars.
Yeah, we know you have like 20 iPhones because you're an Apple fanboy. So
The Apple Podcast app is true garbage, and I would never use it. I use Overcast. It's much better.
All right. Well,
with that unendorsement, everybody, thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.
See ya.